Hi and welcome to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. My name's Ewan Anderson. I'm the Marketing Director here at Eden Scott. This is your essential guide to navigating the ever-changing world of human resources and recruitment. We chat with industry-leading figures to give you the inside track on growing and developing the very best teams. Hi, and welcome back to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. We are joined today by Hannah Roche from MBM Commercial. Hannah is the partner and head of employment law and holistic HR. Hannah, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Ewan. Lovely to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background at MBM Commercial?
Sure. So I have been with MBM Commercial for nearly 14 years, actually, but never a dull moment.
Never.
As you know, I head up the employment law team.
Yeah.
So we advise hundreds and hundreds of clients, the majority of which are small to medium-sized businesses.
Mhm.
And we advise them on all aspects of employment law. So from the very start, when they're taking on new staff, they need contracts of employment, or they might need consultancy agreements or that kind of thing,
Sure.
all the way up to the end of employment, which sometimes is a happy thing and sometimes is not. So, termination of employment, settlement agreements, that kind of thing, and then everything in between. So,
Okay.
it might be advising on family-friendly rights, maternity, paternity, that kind of thing, discrimination, chippy transfers, disciplinaries, grievances, all that kind of thing.
Okay.
And we also assist our corporate colleagues because, as you know, MBM is mostly a corporate law firm, and we are quite often selling businesses, buying and selling, but mostly selling businesses to bigger
Sure.
businesses. And we advise on what happens to the employees in that sort of scenario.
Yeah.
You mentioned holistic HR before, so that's one of the services we run within the department. So that's a sort of fixed fee, annualized helpline, if you like. It's
Okay.
an advice service for small businesses that don't tend to have their own HR in-house.
Okay.
So we've got about 100 companies on that service. So aside from that, I'm also a partner, which means that I'm a part owner of MBM Commercial, and I obviously have to have a management role. And my management role, is staff partner. So since I've been doing that role, I've had much more of an insight into how my clients feel when they have to deal with HR issues.
Okay.
Thankfully, we have very few HR issues here at MBM, but it does. It has been really helpful to get it from the other point of view.
Absolutely.
So that's been good.
Very good. So today there's lots of changes coming from an HR point of view, isn't there, over the next couple of years, really.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get a feel for what that looks like, what's coming down the road, and really just to help people understand what they need to keep an eye out for and how they might adapt their business. So I guess as part of that, there's some changes to the employment rights bill, which was introduced actually in 2023. But as we roll out the changes that come, 2025 and 2026 seem to be quite important years. So, you want to tell us a little bit about the changes that have come as part of that employment rights bill, and what we should be looking out for?
Yeah, sure. So, you're right. The Employment Rights Bill was introduced on the 10th of October last year, and it proposes really very wide-ranging changes to employment law. So, there's changes to the law around unfair dismissal, to the fire and hire practices that some employers operate, to collective redundancies. There's some changes there. 0 hours contracts. There's also changes to trade union law sexual harassment or the prevention of sexual harassment,
Mhm.
third-party harassment, which I'll come on to,
Yeah. Yeah.
changes to statutory sick pay, flexible working, and to family leave.
Wow.
So, as I say, it's really wide-ranging.
There's lots.
Yeah, there's a lot, and of course this is because it was part of the Labour Party's pledge before the election,
Sure.
that it was really going to do a big reform of employment law.
Mhm.
And the purpose was to boost wages, to reduce insecure work, and to grow the economy.
Mhm.
So that's what they've tried to do. There are 28 reforms
Wow.
included in the bill.
Mhm.
But as you see, most are not coming in for quite some time. So it's probably 2026 that the
Yeah.
majority of the changes will come into force.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ones that you've touched on, and we talked about this before, is the unfair dismissal, the proposed changes that are coming in there. So, what sort of thing are we looking out for there in terms of unfair dismissal? What sort of changes are coming down the line?
Yeah, so, well, it's probably useful to look
Mhm.
at the situation we have at the moment and then
Okay.
compare it to how it's going to be when this particular change comes in.
Yeah.
So this is, I'd say, the most significant change, or at least in relation to the type of clients that we have, being
Right.
kind of small to medium-sized businesses. So at the moment, in order for an employee to make a claim of unfair dismissal at the employment tribunal,
Mhm.
they need to have at least 2 years of continuous service with that
Yeah.
employer. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to that. So there's something called automatically unfair dismissal. So if you're dismissed because you're pregnant, or you're dismissed because of trade union activity, something like that, or whistleblowing, you can still make a claim in those circumstances.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But for ordinary unfair dismissal, so let's say you're dismissed for poor performance or misconduct,
Yeah.
or redundancy, you need to have 2 years service in order to make a claim. Otherwise, you're just not eligible to do so.
Sure.
Um, and that has been the situation for really quite a long time now,
Mhm.
that 2 year qualifying period. And what it does, of course, is that it gives the employer a reasonable amount of flexibility,
Yeah.
um, without facing too much in the way of legal risk. So
Yeah.
if things are just not working out for whatever fair reason, and it does still have to be a fair reason, um,
Mhm.
they could part company with the employee and they wouldn't have too much legal risk. There are various other risks, but we won't get into
Sure.
them. That was the main one.
Yeah.
So the Employment Rights Bill is going to change this, because what it says is that unfair dismissal is going to become what's known as a day one right.
Okay.
So from day one of employment, in theory at least, an employee, if they're dismissed, will be able to make an unfair dismissal claim.
Okay. Okay.
So that's obviously a huge
Yeah.
change, and will have a number of consequences. Um, so I think what one of the consequences really will be that there'll be a lot more in the way of tribunal claims, because
Right.
you just
Okay.
have a lot more people who are eligible to make them.
Eligible. Yeah.
Um, and in turn, because there'll be much more litigation, um, it stands to reason that there'll be many more out of court settlements, because a
Okay.
lot of
Okay.
employment claims, or the majority really, are settled out of court. So if there's more
Mhm.
litigation, there's likely to be more settlements.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a change that's not going to come in until autumn of 2026. That's what we've
Okay.
been told so far. So,
Okay.
there's a lot of time for employers to prepare.
Mhm. Mhm.
But part of that will be time for the government to consult on the changes with various stakeholders, including
Mhm.
business.
Mhm.
And when the bill was introduced in October last year, there was quite a lot of commentary from business groups about how this would adversely affect small businesses, not just small
Yeah.
businesses, but particularly them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the fear is that it will lead to less recruitment and less investment in small businesses.
Yeah.
Whether that's the case, it remains to be seen, but certainly employers will want to be doing a lot more diligence on
Yeah.
candidates before taking them on.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So a
Yeah, I
big
mean,
change.
it definitely seems like it's going to impact recruitment, isn't it? But I suppose to that end, it's almost it's going to focus the mind, isn't it? It's going to focus the mind
Yeah,
and make sure your
yeah,
processes in terms of recruitment are really sharp, because the difficulty of having someone who's not the right fit for the business can become really, it's going to become a real challenge quite quickly. Is there some sort of period they're going to introduce as part of that, rather than, obviously day one? Is there going to be a what I think you put in your notes here around a statutory probation period or initial
yeah,
period?
yeah. There is. So, the short form the government has used is that this is going to be a day one right.
Yeah.
But you're right, there is going to be this sort of statutory probationary period,
Mhm,
which
mhm,
they call the initial period, or that's what
mhm,
it's called in the bill.
mhm, mhm.
Um, so the idea appears to be, and this, we're very light on detail at the moment,
Yeah.
but the idea appears to be that there will be still a relatively straightforward way of dismissing employees, for still for fair purposes or fair
Mhm,
reasons,
mhm.
during the initial period for certain potentially fair reasons.
Okay.
And this assumes that the employer is going to follow a modified procedure. So
Mhm,
that's
mhm.
some sort of, you know, something akin to disciplinary procedure, something like that.
Okay.
So the potentially fair reasons, excuse me, I've got one of those January colds that's been going
Yeah.
around. But the potentially fair reasons will be lack of capability to do the job or poor
Okay.
performance, misconduct, um, dismissal because of some statutory restriction. So that's, say, the situation if you take somebody on as a driver
Mhm,
and then they lose their driver's license, then
mhm,
that's a
mhm.
statutory restriction. They can't carry out the job without
Yeah. Yeah.
breaking the
Yeah.
law. So that's a statutory restriction, and dismissal for some other substantial reason. That's a sort of
Mhm.
catch-all reason, but it has to be a really good reason, good fair reason, which justifies dismissal.
Yeah.
So what we know about the provisions in the bill at the moment is that if an employer decides to dismiss an employee within the initial period of employment,
Mhm,
or if the employer gives notice within the period and the termination date is within 3 months of the last day of the initial period,
mhm.
assuming that the dismissal is because of one of the potentially fair reasons I've just mentioned,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
assuming they've followed this modified procedure, details of which we're still waiting for,
Yeah.
um, then they will not be eligible to make an unfair dismissal claim. So
Right.
what that really, I think, means is that you're still going to have this period of time where employers do have flexibility.
Yeah.
Um, it's just that there's going to be a few more hoops to jump through
Yeah.
to show that they have been kind of fair and reasonable in that kind of situation. So the initial period, I mean, that's obviously the crucial question. How long is the initial period?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So we don't actually have confirmation of that yet, but the word in the street is that it's going to be 9 months.
9 months, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I noticed that from some of the
yeah,
detail and some of the notes and so on.
yeah.
What I mean, not to get you to go into the minds of those that have drafted these bills, but where's the advantage? What is the purpose of bringing something like this in? Is it very much a focus on, as you touched on at the top, employee rights, reducing the kind of the lack of certainty around jobs, but also to drive innovation and drive growth? Do you think is that part of this process? Is that part of why this is introduced?
Yeah, I mean, the government has said that the rationale is to, um, you know, give employees more security, and I
Yeah,
guess that's what it will do. I mean, it's a very insecure situation if you start a new job, and you're dismissed within 3 months. That
yeah,
that's going to affect how you lead your life and how
Yeah.
you spend
Yeah.
your money.
Yeah.
So I suppose they want more security for employees, and they are the Labour government. That's what they were set up to do. So I guess they were always going to do something like that. And I suppose in turn they think, well, with more job security, that will drive growth, and you'll get people spending more money
Sure.
because they're more secure in employment, and that will help the economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess that's what the rationale is. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I noticed that, and just to jump ahead, I jump ahead slightly, in terms of tribunal time limits, these
Hmm.
have changed as well, haven't they? And so I suppose, is this going to have an impact as well? Because obviously, if you're bringing more cases like this, then this is going to have an impact. And if the tribunal time limits, you mentioned that at the start, has changed, how will that affect things?
Yeah, so that's an interesting interaction, because you're right, the tribunal time limit. So that's the time that an employee has between the date of the thing that they're complaining about, which
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
could be a discriminatory act by an employer, or it could be a dismissal by an employer.
Mhm, mhm.
Generally speaking, they have around 3 months to make a claim like that, and
Yeah.
it's there's a number of kind of factors that feed into the exact time limit, but
Mhm,
they tend to be pretty strict on that.
mhm,
So,
mhm.
um, that has been for some time considered to be a reasonable period to give the employee to make a claim if they want to do that, but also is balanced against the employer's need for certainty and not
Yeah.
having litigation hanging over them.
Yeah.
So at the moment, it's around about 3 months, but the bill is changing the period to 6 months.
Right.
So that's, it's doubling the period. And
Yeah.
that might be to account for all the additional claims that might come in
Yeah.
because of the day one unfair dismissal rights.
Yeah.
But again, it's a change that favours the employee.
Yeah.
The whole purpose of the Labour Party is to safeguard the rights of workers, and it certainly does that. So,
Yeah.
um, on the one hand, it's not great for employers because it increases that period of uncertainty. You just don't
Yeah.
know when a claim might hit.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
but on the other hand, it does give a longer period in which to kind of settle any dispute out of court.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah. I mean, just to quickly jump back to that unfair dismissal piece, with your experience in terms of some of these cases that I've gone through so far, um, what sort of things or advice can you give to companies who say, right, well, what do we need to do to almost uh, avoid the situation, and nobody's going to avoid it completely. That's life. That's the purpose of this thing, isn't it? Is that, you want to do recruitment, you want to grow, you want to develop your team. Is it a real focus on really understanding the people you want to bring in? Is it sharpening up on your processes? Is it sharpening up on things like job descriptions and so on that can really help avoid the wrong hire, I suppose?
yeah, it's all of those things. I think the job description is an important one because I guess businesses will need to give a lot of thought to what do we need this person to do, or what do we need this job to do,
Yeah.
and is it a straight replacement from the person that used to be in this job, or
Mhm.
do we actually need something different? So maybe it's a bit more thought around, um, you know, what's the function of this job, and
Yeah.
what do we need from the person who's going to do it? So
Mhm, mhm,
a bit more thought around that.
mhm.
um, and then a bit of diligence around the candidate,
Yeah.
or at least a bit more than possibly happens at the moment. That might be more
Yeah.
following up on references. It might be more
Yeah.
stages to interviews. It might be
Yeah.
interviews with numbers, a number of people within the organisation, not just
Yeah.
one. Um, all
Yeah.
that kind of thing. I
Yeah.
don't need to tell you about that. You know all about that kind of
Well,
thing.
no, I
But
mean, it's interesting. We've produced a report that talks about the employees' uh, optimal level of interviews being two, and I envisage that being that
yeah,
potentially changing as companies do try to future-proof themselves and avoid any, an increase in litigation, I suppose. So yeah, it'll be interesting balance as we go forward, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And then I guess as is the case now, but I think it brings it into sharper focus. It's so important for the employer to do their bit as well. So,
Mhm,
you know,
mhm, mhm.
this person has, applied for a job with you, you've taken them on, and then it's really important to get the induction right as well,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
um, you
yeah,
want things to go well for both parties. So induction will be important, and having those review meetings and
yeah,
diarising probation meetings and all that kind of thing.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that part is so important. I appreciate this is delving into the the HR recruitment side of things, but that onboarding, I think sometimes is dismissed as a nice to have. We'll do that, we will make sure that happens, and tends not to. And it's such an important part of that process, isn't it? Because once people come in the door, they want to feel part of the team, and they need to. And I think that's a key part of where issues rise,
Yeah.
issues come up because people haven't had that full introduction to the company.
Yeah, they haven't been integrated as they might have
Integrated.
been, and
Yeah.
also, maybe they just don't have a clear idea of what it is that they're supposed to be doing, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
a pretty isolating feeling. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. I think more focus on induction um, would be really helpful, and
Yeah.
help that person stay in the job and do well.
So just to move on slightly, we talked. You mentioned there that there might be some changes coming in terms of family leave. What's coming down the tracks for that?
Yeah, so there's going to be more day one rights there as well.
Okay.
Um, so this really means that employees will have the right from day one of employment to things like paternity leave. So currently, um, people taking paternity leave have to have at least 26 weeks of continuous service
Yeah. Yeah.
in order to take the leave. But when the bill comes into force, or when that part of the bill comes into force, that will be a day one right.
Day one.
And the reason for that really is to bring paternity leave into alignment with maternity leave and
Yeah.
adoption leave, because those things are already day one rights.
Yeah.
So it's just to kind of equalise the situation there.
Just to line that up. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And you also mentioned flexible working requests, I guess, and I guess this is in line with those day one requests as well. Is it? Is there a change coming there as well?
yeah. There was a small change, but there's already been a slightly bigger change, which
Okay.
some employers may know about and some may have missed. But
Okay.
basically, I mean, the right is not to flexible working. The right is to request
Yeah.
flexible
Yeah.
working,
Yeah.
and for that request to be taken seriously and considered by the employer. And since April last year,
Mhm.
2024,
Mhm.
um, that has been a day one right. So
Yeah.
as soon as they're employed, employees can make a request to work flexibly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that might be to work part-time hours. It
Mhm.
might be to work from home. It might be a job share, something like that.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And what's not changing is that the employer can refuse the request
Mhm.
if
Mhm.
it's for one of a number of prescribed business reasons. So there's a number of reasons. There's 8 or 9 reasons that the employer can give for refusing a request.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
for example, that could be inability to reorganise the work amongst existing staff.
Yeah.
Um, or they might say, if we were to agree to this request, it would have a detrimental impact on the quality of the work that we produce,
Right.
or our performance, or to meet customer demand.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Mhm.
there, and so those are three of the prescribed reasons, and there's a number more.
Yeah.
So that's still the case, but what the bill does is to strengthen the right a bit by introducing a provision that says the employer's refusal of a flexible working request for a prescribed reason has to be reasonable.
Yes. Now
So
I
that's
noticed
the
this
difference.
word
Yeah,
reasonable in your notes, so I
yeah,
was interested to find out
yeah.
what classes as reasonable.
Yeah. Well, we don't know that yet.
Uh,
But I mean, you would like to think that an employer's refusal to a flexible
yeah.
working request would already be reasonable, and I'm
Yes.
sure the
Yes.
majority are.
Yes.
Um, so the reasonableness um, it remains to be seen what that really
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
And I guess, unless the legislation sets out what is going to be reasonable, it will be up to the employment tribunal to
Yeah.
decide
Yeah.
whether an employer has been reasonable. But I guess, I suppose, um, what an employer shouldn't be doing is just plucking out these business reasons and saying, well, I don't really fancy you working part time, so just going to say, no, you
Yeah.
can't because
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
to be a poor impact on
Mhm.
customer demand or whatever it is.
Mhm.
They would probably have to be able to evidence that,
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
and show that that has been a reasonable response.
Mhm.
Um, so there is this change there, and it remains
Mhm.
to be seen how it will pan out. But it's not a major change, and I think
No.
maybe what's more impactful will be not a claim relating to a breach of the flexible working regulations,
Mhm. Mhm.
but a claim relating to discrimination. And the
Ah,
reason for
okay.
that is, quite often flexible working requests are made by women
Mhm. Mhm.
who maybe want to work part time or work from home, and it might be for childcare purposes, something like
Sure.
that. And so the refusal there might amount to sex discrimination.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
yeah, and equally, if the request is made by somebody with a disability and
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
unreasonably refused, then that might
Mhm.
be a disability discrimination claim. So I think that's the bigger risk.
Yeah.
But to be honest, it's always been the bigger risk. So
Yeah.
the change here is a small one, but nonetheless, it's worth noting.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I tell you, we're going to take a little break and we'll be back after this. And so then just moving this on to the changes that are coming down in terms of sexual harassment. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview of those changes?
Yeah, so obviously and unfortunately, sexual harassment has been in the news an awful lot recently.
Yeah.
There's um, some very high profile cases. We've heard about
Yeah.
Harrods, we've heard about the BBC and the allegations against Greg Wallace,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
McDonald's, not there's many many more.
Yeah.
So it's part of the kind of national and indeed international dialogue just now.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think it was something that the government had to do more to address.
Yeah.
Um, so this is another one where a change came in last year,
Mhm.
and another change is coming in via the Employment Rights Bill.
Okay. Okay.
So just to recap, because it was only October last year when the change happened,
Yeah.
and again, some employers might have been aware of it, and perhaps some weren't.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I should say, though, that it has long been the case that employers have an obligation to their employees to safeguard their employees,
Yeah.
um, and they have it's long been the case that employers are vicariously liable for the sexual harassment of one of their employees by another.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the only way that they could get out of that liability was to show that they had taken all reasonable steps to prevent
Mhm.
it, which is really quite a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
All reasonable steps is
Yeah.
hard to evidence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, employees, I guess, were already fairly well protected,
Mhm.
but by the law at least.
Yeah.
But now what's happened is, since October, there's a proactive duty on employers to
Yeah.
take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a sort of forward-looking obligation rather than a backward-looking
Yeah.
obligation, if you
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, that might be something like we've carried out equalities training,
Mhm.
we've
Mhm.
carried out training about what conduct is acceptable and what's
Mhm.
not. We've carried out risk assessments, and we've looked at areas in our business where perhaps employees are at particular risk
Yeah.
of sexual harassment, and then we've identified those risks, and then we've thought about what we can do to address them, and we've implemented them.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that new proactive obligation came in October, as I
Yeah.
say, and if an employee can show that an employer has failed in that new duty, then the employment tribunal can increase the award that it gives to the employee for being harassed,
Mhm.
can be increased by up to 25%.
Right. Okay.
And the type of awards, they can be very, very high. So
Mhm.
25% or up to 25% on top can be very significant.
Absolutely.
So that's a big deterrent there. And
Yeah.
also the Equality Commission can investigate the employer and can take enforcement action.
Okay.
So that's the other sort of penalty. So as I say, some employers will be all over this and have
Yeah.
taken steps already. Others, it might be a bit less familiar to
Yeah.
them. But as I say, that's already come into force.
Mhm.
But the new Employment Rights Bill will take things a step further.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so what the bill does, it extends the responsibility to cover third parties.
Right. Okay.
So, in other words, when the change takes place, employers will be under a duty to not only take reasonable steps to prevent the harassment of their employees by other employees, but
Yeah.
also by
Yeah.
third parties. So that would be, clients, contractors, visitors
Yeah.
to your premises, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that relates to all forms of harassment,
Okay.
disability harassment,
Mhm. Mhm.
racial harassment, not
Mhm.
just sexual harassment.
Okay. Okay.
So that's known as the obligation to prevent third party harassment.
Yeah.
Um, so that's obviously going to make things harder for employers.
Yeah.
They clearly, they've got less control over third parties than they do over their own employees,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it makes the financial stakes higher.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, they need to really. It's particularly important and impactful for employers in the hospitality and retail sectors.
Okay. Yeah.
Because they're dealing with third parties, public
So many different
hospitality. Yeah,
suppliers and so on. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, that is. I mean, that's quite an extension, isn't it? So, I mean, quite challenging, I would suggest. Is there any practical steps? You mentioned a couple of things there around training and so on.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that people should be thinking about if you've not already, addressed this at work? Then is there anything that
Yeah.
companies can have a think about?
Well, as a kind of bare minimum, they should ensure that they've got the correct kind of policies in place.
Yeah, yeah.
So workplace policies, there's equality, diversity and inclusion policy.
Mhm.
There should be an anti-bullying and harassment policy, and they
Mhm.
might even have a separate standalone sexual harassment or prevention of sexual harassment policy.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
so they need to be put in place if they're not already in place.
Mhm.
If they are in place, they need to be reviewed to make sure they're up to date, they're still fit for purpose.
Yeah, yeah,
And all employers really need to make sure that they're not just words written on a page, that actually employees have seen them, have read them, and understood them. Can ask questions about them, and that they follow those policies. So
yeah, yeah,
that's the first kind of thing.
yeah,
Um, the second thing, as you've mentioned there, is to ensure that there's regular training in relation to equality in the workplace
yeah.
and preventing discrimination and harassment.
Mhm, mhm,
And again, that needs to take place regularly, maybe once a year.
mhm.
It needs to be tailored to the organisation in
Okay.
question. So, there's no point having training with a whole load of scenarios that relate to retail if you work in an office.
Yeah.
And different kinds of businesses will have different pinch points, if you like, different risk factors. Yeah, so I've mentioned hospitality. There's issues there. There's a lot of contact with the general public. There might also
Yeah.
be consumption of alcohol. But
Yes.
in professional services firms, they've got different kind of risks. There's kind of more power dynamics because there's a
Mm.
very hierarchical traditional structure to most of these kind of organizations. But the other thing is a cultural. The culture has to be right. It's really a
Yeah.
cultural matter, and I suppose culture often comes from the top, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's the person who's responsible for HR in an organization. They should be really trying to talk to those senior management, getting kind of buy-in that this is something that we need to take seriously,
Yeah.
and we want to ensure that we have a really safe and enjoyable work environment for everybody.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. The leadership side of things is so important to drive those cultures and to ensure that people feel safe at work, especially as you mentioned there. I wasn't even thinking about if you're working in hospitality, alcohol is involved as well. There's a whole raft of opportunities, and I suppose it's just, taking reasonable steps to make sure that your employees are safe at all times is, it can be challenging, but I think if you're seen to make sure that you're doing everything you can, and it comes from leadership, then actually there's, you're doing all you can to make sure that happens. And it's not entirely easy when there's scenarios where you're out and about in different places and so on. But I think if you've taken every opportunity, then I think, you're going in the right direction, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
saves you a lot of pain in the long run.
Yes. No, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that. I think that there's a lot of changes that are coming down the road, particularly around that day one right. I think that isn't it's the day one right changes that are really going to have an impact. And a lot of these things, while they aren't going to take place until 2026, it's about making sure that you're getting ready and that you're preparing yourself and just staying ahead of the game. Obviously, as you mentioned, some of the detail hasn't really come out yet, but actually, using, speaking to the team at MBM or checking it, I would no doubt there'll be blogs and content on there just to keep people up to date and abreast of all the changes.
Yeah.
Is there 3 top tips, I guess, you could give us and give our listeners just to help them steer the right path?
Yeah, well, sign up for legal updates.
Yes.
That might be with us, or we're going to be running training sessions as and when we know a bit more detail. So if you're the person in your organisation responsible for HR, there's so much in the way of resource out there, and a lot of it is free. So make use of that. Make sure that you're ahead of the game, as you say. Start talking to senior management now about these changes.
Okay.
Because I think if you're a senior manager but your focus is not HR, and you're maybe on the sales side or whatever it is, this might not be your top focus.
Yeah, sure.
But it is going to have an impact on budgets. It's going to have an impact on recruitment plans and just the kind of general mindset of the employer. So start a dialogue about it now. And really the third thing is, and you probably think, oh, well, you would say this, but the third thing, when the changes do come into force, it's worth taking legal advice before taking action with regard to employees, because it could be a 10-minute phone call that saves you a world of pain afterwards.
Yes, absolutely.
That will do the trick. So,
absolutely.
when these changes are so far-reaching and so unfamiliar, it's worth taking a little bit of legal advice to make sure that you don't end up in employment tribunal.
No problem. Well, thank you again, Hannah. It's been a great discussion today. I really enjoyed that, and some great insight for our listeners as well. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll hopefully catch up soon.
Thanks, Ewan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. Hopefully there was plenty of insight for you to take back to your teams. So don't forget to subscribe and never miss an episode. And if you can, leave us a review. We really appreciate all the feedback and support we get. It makes a massive difference.